Alright, since it is the Halloween season, I decided to do something that is incredibly unoriginal, but why not? Because we got a lot of free time to kill. Uh, I'm going to do a comparative analysis of the two Elm Street films, the original 1984 film directed by Wes Craven, and the 2010 remake directed by the guy that did Smells Like Teen Spirit video. Now, I know what you're thinking. Clearly, the outcome of this comparative analysis is quite obvious, but I think it's worth going into detail for just because it might give us a little bit of insight into what's going wrong with modern horror film remakes. Okay, first off, we're going to compare the scripts of the two films, which is a little arbitrary, seeing as how through and through the scripts for both films are pretty much identical. Clearly, the Elm Street remake is updated using more contemporary social constructs. There are people using the internet, and it's more modern, obviously, than Elm Street as far as a lot of the plot dynamics are concerned. Whether or not the remake actually improves upon the basic plot line of the original is very, very, very debatable, and I'm going to argue that it isn't. One of the things that I think made the original Elm Street film such an effective flick was it was very much a mystery. You really didn't know who Freddy Krueger was until pretty much the last 20 minutes of the film. Within Elm Street 2010, they pretty much start getting into it right away. And they have that whole subplot where maybe, just maybe, Krueger was innocent, and they're kind of going back and forth and kind of teasing you. And ultimately, it just becomes very cumbersome, and the denouement for the remake just goes on forever, and it's just really not well paced in any regard. And the characters are very flat, and everything's one dimensional, and the pacing just isn't there. So in comparing the two films, I think it's pretty obvious that if you had to pick one, then the original Elm Street is definitely superior. So that's one for the 1984 flick. And then we come to acting, and I have to admit I'm not a fan of acting in either of these films. If you go back and watch Elm Street 84, there are some really, really painful scenes involving some incredibly cheesy dialogue. And I think that outside of Robert Englund, no one in the film really puts on a performance that's really worth talking about. But the shocking thing to me was you go and watch Elm Street movie, it came out almost 30 years later, and somehow the acting is even worse. Like, one of the things that I really, really hate about horror films is when they have movies that are set in high schools, and they're using actors that are clearly in their late 20s, and they do not look anything at all like high school students. It's really bad in Elm Street from '84, but in the remake, I swear to God, there's this one girl who is like almost 30 trying to play a 17-year-old, and it's just utterly, another thing about Elm Street 2010, you gotta talk about the two Krugers, and it's a no contest. The Jackie Earl Haley guy, you give him credit, he tried, but overall he was just doing a really, really bad rehash of the Rorschach performance from The Watchmen. Whereas Robert Englund was actually kind of spooky and awesome in his role. So if you had to compare the acting in the two films, then once again, 1984's Elm Street is clearly superior. Okay, direction. Now this is a really, really unfair fight when you think about it, because Wes Craven is one of the greatest horror auteurs in history, and Samuel Bayer, this was his first mainstream feature film, and he's used to doing music videos. But even so, we're doing a comparative analysis, and there's no way around. Elm Street 84 is just a way, way better directed motion picture than Elm Street 2010. There are just way too many jump cuts in the remake. There's just too much flash. The suspense is not there. The angles are very bad. The lighting, a lot of times, is just awful. The structure and a lot of the placement of props in Elm Street 2010, I think, is very subpar and looks kind of unprofessional. And while Elm Street 84 is not really a perfect film in any regard, I think that Craven really does enough to kind of make it consistent throughout. And when you're watching Elm Street, you feel like you're watching a film that is in the sure hands of someone who really knows what he's doing. Whereas with Elm Street 2010, you're just like, wow, this guy's clearly a first-time director. It's like during the opening credits, they actually make the point to show actual elm trees, because clearly that was not stated enough in the original film. So it's just very, yeah, it's just very awkward most of the times when we're watching the remake. So once again, 1984's Elm Street. I consider the victor in comparing the two. Alright, special effects. This is one of those things where you kind of look at it and you're saying, well, okay, A Nightmare on Elm Street came out, you know, what is it, almost 30 years after the original Elm Street film. You got CGI, you have all these, benefactors that you can be using to improve upon the overall special effects content in the original. And you watch the two films side by side, and I don't know about you, but I walked away with the sensation that, yeah, 84's Elm Street was clearly a superior film as far as special effects are concerned. Yeah, the makeup in Elm Street was very, very good. I like the way Freddy Krueger kind of looked like a Vaseline-covered prune for most of the picture, and of course the blood effects were outstanding in that film. Whereas in Elm Street 2010, most of the effects were all computer generated, and for the most part they looked really, really bad. Like the blood was very unrealistic. A lot of the murder scenes just looked incredibly artificial, and I really hated the way Freddy Krueger looked in the remake. He looked basically like a cat. The entire time I'm watching the movie, I'm just seeing an anthropomorphic cat on screen, and I was just overall not impressed by the special effects department in the remake. So once again, we're given the keys here to the original Elm Street film. And now we come to the final and deciding category, well, not really, overall quality. And in case you haven't noticed, it's kind of a one-sided affair. A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 is one of the most beloved horror classics of the last 30 years, whereas A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010, well, for lack of a better word, sucked hard. Now, the thing is, I'm not really a huge fan of the original Elm Street. I think it's a really good film, and it's probably better than most mainstream horror films from the time frame. But overall, I'm not really seeing it as the classic that most people do. I've always kind of preferred the third Elm Street film, The Dream Warriors, way more. As far as I'm concerned, not only is that the best Elm Street movie, that's really the only Elm Street movie worth really talking about and celebrating. But we're not talking about that, we're talking about the original, and while I think it's really imperfect and kind of, awkward and cheesy in many elements, there's still a lot of parts of the film that's really chill and becomes suspenseful and atmospheric, and everything I think comes to a very fitting conclusion. And there are some problems here and there with the plot, and there's some plot holes that pop up periodically, but overall I think when you finish the film you're probably going to enjoy it. Whereas with Elm Street 2010, by the time it's over, you're just glad it's over because it's just so overlong and nothing really happens, and the acting is just atrocious, and the lines of dialogue are just so, ham-fisted, and they kind of go back and forth about whether or not Freddy Krueger is innocent, and just kind of delays everything, and the kills are pretty uninspired, and it's just overall a really just trying film, and you're going to be bored halfway through it, and there's really nothing positive I can say about the film. No, there actually isn't anything positive except the film at all. It blows. So there you go. Clearly, the winner in every conceivable category you can imagine. The original Elm Street from 1984 just kicks the living crap out of Samuel Bayer's Elm Street from 2010. So there you go. If you had to pick one, I think the answer is really, really obvious right here. So go Robert Englund, not so much Rorschach.